All right, welcome everybody. Welcome to the Sports Community of Practice. This is our January 29th, 2024, have the wrong year on there, edition. We are joined by Jennifer Jensen, the curator at the Jackie Robinson Museum, for what is going to be an enormous treat today. What she has to share with us is groundbreaking in our field, and I think really thought-provoking, and gives us all a lot of direction of kind of where we can go with sports. And really what all can happen in the museum space. I want to kick off by just talking a little bit about our sports community of practice. We are an organization that is part of NEMA, the New England Museum Association, and we're meeting around 6 times a year in order to pull together members of this community to assess the interests and needs of what we need as museum professionals who are trying to interpret sports, whether it's in a sports museum setting, a non-sports museum setting, or commemorative type settings such as statues or public spaces that are outside the museum walls. Anything that has to do with sports interpretation. And so this is a space where we can ask questions and think a little bit deeper about what it is we're doing as professionals. We're meeting around 6 times a year, bi-monthly, and we're looking at applicable projects that really will help give us and expand our replicable practices for sports interpretation. And then we're sharing and collaborating. So we really encourage you to use the chat during the meeting, share ideas. We also want this to be a place where we can come together as professionals to find collaborative projects, ways that we can expand and take new directions with the work that we're doing. So all of that is sort of under the umbrella of what we're doing here. And we are also open to suggestions, and we want to hear your feedback on what it is you most want out of these sessions, what would be the most helpful to you, or ideas that you may have for sessions, for projects that you think would really fit under the purview of what we're talking about here, and how we are looking at taking sports interpretation in a new direction. So really the field is very ripe for that. And we're looking at all the different ways it can expand into different spaces. And so you can send ideas over to us. We're really interested in hearing what you want to hear out of this. And also if you want to participate in this community of practice, if you want to do anything, help out, be part of any of the leadership of it, let us know what your interest might be. We're very interested to know some of that. I'll give you an email address in just a bit. Let's first start out by meeting each other. If you'll just put in the chat what your name is, what your institution is. You could also put something fun like your favorite sport. You could also let us know, maybe what you're most interested in or a question that you may have, something that plagues you about sports interpretation, or something you really love about it. It's just something of interest about you and how you come to the field. Mostly we want to know who you are, where you're located, what your institution is, so we can kind of get a sense of who's here with us today. We're going to have some time for Q&A later where we'll get a chance to kind of see each other and chat through it. So go ahead and let us know in the chat box that information about each of you so we can kind of know who we are. All right. And then yeah, so we want to know what you're seeking. What would you like to get out of the sports community of practice? What help or support do you or your organization need? It's really going to help inform what's going on in the field and what issues we most need to address here in our community of practice. And then how would you like to participate? So you can send replies to connect@interpretingsports.com. I'll intercept those and can help, figure out how to best get you connected. And then just a little bit about who we are. So myself and Doug Stark work together collaboratively and do consulting with interpreting sports. So we are museum professionals that believe that sports is more than just a game. It reflects the core of social identity. And our mission is simple but not small. We're recentering the international sports conversation on empathy, balanced humanity, and authentic connection, one interpretive project at a time. And we recently released a book called Interpreting Sports at Museums and Historic Sites. And a lot of what we're pulling for this community of practice is sort of coming from the research out of this book. And there's also some greater, wider connection. We had 32 global contributors in this book, and about, I think, 24 case studies that were featured. specifically not including examples that were given in theme essays. This book comprises about 30 years of research on the part of both Doug and I, and then all combined with our collaborators, hard to even know how many years in the field. And so there are a few other tangential books that sort of are surrounding this one that are also great resources. Ours is sort of the first of its kind, certainly in terms of interpretation specifically. And so we're sort of gleaning off of the principles that we have in this book, the game plan that we uncovered, and the ways to so the replicable practices of interpreting sports history. So you can find us at interpretingsports.com. connect@interpretingsports is our email address. And the book still, I believe there's a 30% off discount, I think until the end of February or maybe into March. So if you haven't picked one up yet, you can get a 30% off discount on Rowman and Littlefield if you'd like to. Otherwise it's available on Amazon and Barnes & Noble if you want to grab a copy. All right, so in this session, we're going to examine how to create balanced sports interpretation, and we're going to really unpack what that looks like. That is a almost simple phrase, I would say, for what we're really going to talk about in today's session. We're going to learn about sports and inclusivity and audience engagement. So like, why is it important to be inclusive in your sports interpretation and how that really feeds into audience engagement? And we're going to really assess your needs and share resources. So again, please use the chat. Please ask questions. We're going to have Q&A at the end. We also are extending our community of practice sessions to an hour and a half, starting with today. So we will stay on after the top of the hour for anyone who wants to stick around and ask questions or continue the dialogue or the conversation. You may have only have the hour that you scheduled for today because we didn't have that in the announcement yet, but going forward, all of our community practices will be that hour and a half. So we have enough time for the presenters to share and also time for the discussion, because we really know how important that is in this community to have the discussion about what we're seeing, what we're struggling with, and how we might replicate resolve some of that. So for today, this is the game plan of our interpreting sports book that Doug and I laid out. Examine the field and develop themes is step one. Consider your constituents, so invested identities and interest, and then expand the scope, global reach, and to talk about inclusive narratives. And after, engage your audience through community involvement and educational programming, and then really a call to look at where sports interpretation can go. We're going to focus on inclusive narratives specifically today, but really everything that's included in the game plan all kind of comes together and really has been a part of what the Jackie Robinson Museum did to create the exhibit they have now. We're just going to try to put a bit of a highlight and a narrow focus on what it means to create an inclusive narrative, why you would do that, and the impact and the reach that it can have. Just a small overview about inclusive narratives in sports history. So one of the key principles that we're looking at in terms of creating more balanced interpretation is deconstructing long-held ideologies that have existed in sports and a lot of mythologies that have existed. So we really started to look at underrepresented experiences and narratives in sports related to things like immigration, identity, ethnicity, equity, competition, community building, social interaction, urbanization, and globalization. And truly, just to name a select few, there are so many different avenues that we can take. And a lot of times when people think inclusivity, there's just one or two of these topics that they might be thinking of. And we really are encouraging practitioners to think very broadly about all of the different avenues of inclusivity that you can explore and the reasons why you may want to explore as many as possible. And so what we found is that practitioners can present these topics to foster a much more holistic understanding of sports and its impact on individuals and society. And that is also a very loaded statement all by itself. Sports has an enormous impact on individuals and society and vice versa. What is driving sports and what's sort of happening underneath it is so expansive and really worth shining a light on. And doing this by demythologizing athletics along with their heroes and villains. And not to say that we want to ask people to stop having sports heroes, or stop pointing out when people are acting and behaving in ways that doesn't match the values of their community. What we want to do is take away some of the mythology that has kept us from being able to see the whole human being playing the sport, or the humans that make up the team that they're on and the organizations that they're a part of. And that's what we're going to dive into really deeply today. And so one other note I want to make about this is just when we think about sports interpretation, we're looking at what we call a hybrid framework method. And I've got a lot of things listed here. I want to really just talk about the things that I have highlighted here in the middle. This hybrid method, what that means to us is that when you're interpreting sports, we encourage you to look at the celebratory approach, this more, excited, emotional qualities, and looking at just the historical accuracy of what's made people happy about this, and why do people show up to sports and what's fun about it. We also want to acknowledge the importance of identity that is highlighted by the commemorative approach, and looking at our commemorative practices, particularly in America, in the Western world. What are our commemorative practices? How are they serving us? And so we know that commemoration is a very key part of interpreting sports, and we think it's important to keep that as part of the interpretation. We also really encourage practitioners to discuss a wide range of issues and topics that are relevant and contemporary for the socially relevant approach. And we think the combination of these three is what makes really great sports interpretation, attracts the audience, gets people engaged, helps them see themselves and their identity, and that's connected to the sport, as well as broadening their perspective on what they may not already know about it or how they might not be viewing it. And as practitioners, we have in a way that opportunity and that responsibility to help, steer them in a direction they may not have really thought of going before. As audience members, coming to see subjects that I just want to point out, in many cases, our audience thinks, and in fact, in some cases might know more about the subject in certain areas because they've lived it, they have lived experience, or they've heard stories for years and years and years. And so it's important to remember, how they're coming to the content and what we can do to help expand their vision of what they already know. All right, so with that being said, I want to now turn it over to Jennifer and I are gonna engage in a dialogue around what has happened at the Jackie Robinson Museum. And I want to start by just saying that this community of practice started with a conversation Jennifer and I had in November. I had the opportunity of visiting the Jackie Robinson Museum in New York City. It's a new museum, fairly new museum. And she'll share a little bit more about all that. But it was such an engaging conversation. It was immediately could see that they had done what we've been doing very similar work, essentially, in a very similar timeline. And what they're doing is quite groundbreaking. So we are going to dive into a series of questions, and Jennifer, yeah, there we go. Oops. So Jennifer Jensen is the curator at the Jackie Robinson Museum. Jennifer, do you want to say a few words just to kind of get us started here?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Jennifer Jensen. I'm the curator at the Jackie Robinson Museum. And I will say that I came to this position actually more because I had done both sports work, but actually most of the work that I had done prior to this was in the areas of social justice and civil rights. Although I did a variety of things. I don't want to say that was the only thing, but they actually found me because I had just finished up a exhibit called Diversity in Baseball, but I had actually before that had done work for the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center and actually the Boston Children's Museum, and we toured an exhibit called Native New England Families, 5 tribal communities. And so my work has sort of always been in this space, and I've actually touched on sports at every job I've ever had, but that's sort of how I ended up here. So I think we can jump in. I will say the Jackie Robinson Museum opened in September of 2022, after a very, very sort of long run up. I think lots and lots of people had been wondering if we were ever going to open, but we are officially open to the public and have been for a little over a year now.
Yeah, thanks. And thank you. Scarlett is facilitating our slideshow here. We're gonna have it just rolling so guys can see. Jennifer really wanted to give everybody sort of an overview of the exhibit space. You can see that as we go through our discussion. So you get a sense of what it actually looks like and how they laid out this story. All right, thanks for that background, Jennifer. So let's kind of dive in. So
Okay.
as you pointed out, the Jackie Robinson Museum opened to the public in September 2022, but the project took close to 15 years to complete. So can you tell us a little bit about the original goals for the museum? Was it actually intended to be a sports museum from
Well,
the beginning?
Rachel Robinson, Jackie Robinson's widow, who is actually still with us, she's 101 years old now, conceived in sort of the middle of the aughts that she wanted a museum dedicated to her husband's legacy. Prior to that, she had started the Jackie Robinson Foundation, which gives needy African-American students college scholarships and mentoring and leadership training. And so in addition to that, though, she really felt that a museum that could tell Jackie's legacy was critically important. And the goal wasn't in the beginning for it to be a sports museum. Obviously, there was going to be sports in it, but she really wanted to look at the full scope of Jackie's life, particularly focused on his work in civil rights. And so it did take almost 15 years between fundraising and a bunch of other issues, but primarily fundraising. When they started their fundraising project, it was 2007. Obviously, we all know what happened in 2008 with Bernie Madoff and the collapse of basically the US financial situation. And so they took a pause and they began fundraising again at the end of 2012, beginning of 2013. And it took about 5 years from then to actually get enough money to bring on a staff to begin the work. Although while that was ongoing, they had engaged with design firms to begin the project. And so what's interesting about this project and different from this project that I don't know, a lot of museums, I think, particularly early startup museums, are looking at is the design actually came from the firm that we had originally hired to work with us, Ralph Alphabom Associates. And the content came at the time they hired me. We also hired Howard Bryan. I don't know if any of you are familiar with him. He works for ESPN and a whole bunch of other organizations as a sports journalist, and he's an author. And so the two of us came on with the plan to design and create the content, but we were basically building the content into an existing design frame. So we had big ideas and big thoughts about what each one of our exhibit experiences were going to be, but it really was sort of already shoehorned into what the space was going to look like. So I guess that's sort of, how the museum started, but the intent was always to tell sports stories about Jackie, but it wasn't designed or intended as a sports museum.
Yeah, that's really interesting. There's a couple things you highlighted there that I think are so relatable. One, that the fundraising took a long time. I mean, that a lot of the lead up to this project was waiting to get things ready. And I know, virtually every project faces that uphill battle when you're getting off the ground. I love that it really was intended to be about his life in the beginning, but then, as you pointed out, this mix in the way that mix up was like sort of a little backwards in the way that the planning was put together, and that the design was there first before the interp was there, and kind of set the stage a little bit for what we see next in this project. So so just to kind of piggyback on what happened next, as we know, the entire world was affected by COVID and the murder of George Floyd in the summer of 2020. how did this change the focus and the narrative of the Jackie Robinson Museum?
Right. So, like I had said, we had originally sort of thought this is going to be a museum about his life and legacy. It definitely fit into what I would call the great man narrative. Like, how was Jackie great and why was he great? And then we realized that, as great as we thought our writing had been up until that point, we were going to do a huge disservice to Jackie for a few different reasons, but also we needed to shift. So we took the script and we basically threw it away, which when you're looking at a year and a half, 2 years worth of work is a little sickening. But we didn't lose everything we had. I mean, the exhibits were still going to be in the same space, based on the same themes, based on the same sort of general narratives. But instead, we took the standpoint that we had to engage with Jackie's full humanity, and we needed, really, the most important thing was to demythologize. And I think it's funny that those are the words that I was using, and Catherine has been using in her work as well, is that we needed to give Jackie his agency in his own story. And that had to be the center. So instead of telling, say, like the Branch Rickey story, with Branch Rickey hand selects Jackie Robinson to break the color barrier, we were like, there's a very good reason why Jackie Robinson was the person who got selected. And by giving him his agency in the choice to actually choose number one, to also agree to be the one who's going to break the color barrier, but even more so, why was Jackie that person? Why was he the only one that Rickey thought was going to be the right person to do this? And truly, in the entire United States, although Rickey quickly signs 4 more Black players, he knows that Jackie is going to be that person. And so why was he that person? One, and we'll do a little bit of rundown just so you get a sense of who, Jackie was. Number one, he grew up on the West Coast. He had lots of experience working with other white players. He had played on basically all white teams, other than a handful of other Black players. So when he played both at Pasadena Community College and at UCLA, he was a team leader as a Black man on basically white teams with a handful of other Black players at his side. So his comfort level around white people was crucially important. That college education also tremendously important to Rickey. He wanted somebody who was going to be confident, articulate, and comfortable in a world that was basically run by white men and white people. And then even more so, Jackie's already a massive sports celebrity, massive. He had been selected to the 1941 All-America collegiate football team. He had been the number one basketball player in 1940 and 1941, in both years, having scored the most points in the United States. You'll notice, though, that he was not actually elected to that position because he was a Black man. That was not going to be acceptable. So Sports Illustrated did not put him on the cover of the magazine either of those years. He was obviously a very good baseball player, but played for a pretty lousy college team. And then also probably would have attended the 1940 Olympics as the American selection for the broad jump had it happened. So he was a well-known sports commodity across the United States by anybody who is following sports by the time he lands in front of Branch Rickey in 1945. And it's all of these different pieces that make him sort of the clear choice to be able to go ahead and do this. On top of which, while he had served in the United States military during World War II, he had commanded all Black regiments, had been a morale officer, and had already fought off pretty public allegations of racism in sort of the broader press in the United States. So Rickey sort of knew he was going to be able to have the backbone to survive integrating Major League sport. And so all of those things were sort of like critically important to understanding who he was. But also, it's very clear that Robinson had all of these things in place that made him the only obvious selection to do this at the time. And so that part of the story that we do tell in the museum is critical to sort of understanding all the other things that Robinson is going to do in his life, and really focus in on Robinson being one who is the person who breaks the color barrier. Ricky is only, opening the door for this possibility, rather than Ricky gives him the opportunity. And it's because of Ricky that Robinson breaks the color barrier. And we really wanted to break that barrier down. And there are lots of other places in the museum, in different storytelling, where that narrative of him, gets challenged over and over and over again. I think that probably covers that.
Yeah, I mean, what's so fascinating about this is that you guys were able to see that if you'd kept him up on the pedestal as sort of
Yep.
like great man, there's so much about his personhood that would have not been
Right.
showcased. Also, that seeing his personhood really illuminated why he was able to do what he did in sports. And I think that connection is incredibly, incredibly important.
Yeah, I think like sort of along those lines too, we didn't want him to just be this icon. One of the things that we really love about Jackie, and because he's constantly giving us in every sort of area, he had an opinion on absolutely everything. So, I mean, he's sort of a great character because of that. But I think one of the other things that we felt was really important is Robinson is really unique in the sense that he was always able to be like, oh, I was wrong about that. I'm going to take that back. I made a mistake. I am fallible. And I think one of the things when you're telling a story about somebody who is so well known in so many ways, to be able to say, actually, he's super relatable. He's a human being. He makes errors. He's willing to accept that he makes errors, was so important to the way we framed our narrative. And so sort of by able to like sort of ripping up that original sort of great man, great hero and saying, actually, yeah, he is heroic in certain areas, and certainly heroic in his ability to voice his concerns throughout the civil rights movement. I think those are like, that's really where we wanted to focus our story, was really on his voice, his celebrity, and his ability to use that to make profound change in the United States. Um, but sort of like negating this idea of like the man on the pedestal and just making him a person was at the core of absolutely everything we did as we sort of thought about how we were going to tell his story in particular.
Yeah, and as you pointed out, that actually makes him more relatable, which allows for more inspiration amongst
Yes.
the visitors to then go and take agency in their own lives, as opposed to there being this like distance between them and the hero that feels so unrelatable that it doesn't become personal. And that clearly has a huge impact in your space. So let's kind of get into that. So in our first conversation last year, we did, as you pointed out, spoke about demythologizing Robinson and giving him his full humanity, as we're talking about, really putting that as a central tenet of the museum. So let's dig a little bit deeper into this. You've already said a few things. Can you say a little bit more about what that looks like in practice? How did that actually play out? And how does it function in the museum now?
Right. So I think that at the core of what we were doing is yes, we have a whole gallery, as you can tell, that's dedicated to Jackie Robinson as athlete, Jackie Robinson as baseball player. But I think at the core, when we're telling that story in our main gallery space, and you come in and it's thematically arranged around civic engagement, activism, entrepreneurship, and his family life, sort of across that, we really used sports as a vehicle to explain his values and to actually get to the heart of who he really was as an individual, focusing very specifically on his work in the civil rights movement and as an activist. So if we frame that sort of around this idea of like civic engagement, which is the first column, we talk about his military service. We talk about his writing back and forth with senators and presidents, and how he really used his voice to engage sort of the entirety of sort of the American populace. Um, so the things that he cared really most about, obviously, were the idea of equity. for African Americans, but it wasn't just for African Americans. It was for the Hispanic community, specifically Puerto Ricans in New York City. It was for Jews, and he developed a longstanding relationship with both the Jewish community and the African American church communities, developing and creating bridges there. But really, at the heart of everything we were doing was, again, giving him that full humanity and really using the idea of Jackie Robinson specifically as a leader in all of these different areas to tell his broader story. Because right from the beginning of his life, even as a young man playing, sports in high school and in college, he was always looking for an opportunity to benefit and improve the circumstances of his own community. And so, as soon as he realized his own celebrity was going to be the thing that was going to really allow him to break out and beyond sort of the narrow structure of baseball player, he realized that, by engaging with Martin Luther King and the Southern Christian Leadership Council, and with the National Urban League and the NAACP, he's doing all of these things over the course of his life, sort of during baseball and sort of, but much more prominently in the late 50s and 1960s after baseball. He's engaging, he's traveling all over the country because he knows as soon as Jackie Robinson shows up somewhere, the newspapers show up, the TV cameras show up. And by being sort of that magnet and then, exploring why he personally is standing up for these issues, it really gives light to who he was sort of across his entire life, and really focused on the ideas of, fair housing, fair employment law, and voting rights, the sort of the vast sort of scope of all of things that were really critically important in the middle of the 20th century for Black Americans.
Wow, fascinating. Yeah, it in the way that you frame it, and I think the way that you guys sort of talked it through, the sports becomes the vehicle for what he does, and also
Right,
sort of like it's the way he makes money, right? So it's what he
right.
does. Yeah. It's his job, right? The
It
rest
is,
is
it is his job.
yeah.
And it's interesting though. One of the things he definitely says, even very early, it's like 1947, and he's working with Wendell Smith on his first autobiography, and he says, "I could not, basically squander this opportunity for my people. That I had to stand up, face the racist vitriol, so that I personally." Could become the person who like holds the door open for everybody who comes up after me. And that sort of central tenet is the thing that we follow up on in all of the different themes in Robinson's life, whether that's being the first African American to graduate from Fort Riley as an officer, whether and ensuring that then once he's done that, that he's holding that door open for all these other Black officers to come up behind him, whether that's being the what's incredible is even after sports, he's the first executive officer at a major American, like sort of the level of a Fortune 500 company. It didn't exist in 1957 when he goes to work for Chock full of Nuts, but he's the first African American to hold that sort of executive level position at an American company. And so he's always like kicking down those doors to make sure that everybody who's coming up behind him is going to be able to do the same things that he's, for a whole set of, obvious gifts, was able to do.
Yeah, he was a very seems in a way unique person at a specific time in history where he was able to do that. Um,
Yeah, I mean, it's so funny because we're so lucky to have, somebody who really is an exemplar for how to live one's life as, as the person whose story, we get to identify and tell. That's, it's it's great because I think there are sort of more complicated individuals, maybe that unlike Robinson, who do have important stories to tell that maybe sort of like across the board aren't, so, naturally like giving and fantastic in the way that Robinson really was. And the addition is also that Robinson, for over a decade, wrote a syndicated news column. He was on TV and on radio. And so he's really given us a breadth of, writing and, action that we, can really tell sort of this full scope of his life because it was, so well documented. And so I think sometimes the hard thing when you're telling stories like this is, what does the documentation look like? Is it going to be great? But in his case, wow, like, I couldn't be luckier.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's an interesting point. And it's one of the things that we all have to think about when interpreting, saying, okay, we're going to, interpret someone's whole life or their whole personhood. If they've got more difficult things to talk about, more challenging subjects, that obviously adds a different wrinkle. And you guys, in a way, were fortunate that there wasn't really a lot about Jackie's life that you would have wanted to shy away from. So it's kind of interesting to hear this particular perspective on
Yeah.
this
I
kind
mean,
of
and
work.
even in those places where, certainly in the late 1960s, he's being called, an Uncle Tom. People are like, oh, he isn't supporting us in the way that, we would like him to, or like, oh, he's so old, like, which is funny because in the late 1960s, he's, like the same age as I am, late 40s, early 50s, he doesn't understand young people or he doesn't understand the mores of the day. But what's really interesting, and I think like always got us excited, and I was like, wait, no, I'm like, here he is in Brooklyn in 1968 supporting the Black Panthers in court. Like, I'm standing up for all of these things. I think one of the things that people don't sort of really understand is by 1968, particularly after MLK, because they had been such close friends, assassination, he is just so disillusioned with American politics. But unfortunately, just a few years later, he's dead. And so we don't really have a sense of, who he would have become both politically, actively. I don't think he would have ever given any of this up. I think we just didn't get to see him evolve into maybe somebody who was a little bit more militant. Although one of the things I always find interesting is he talks about MLK, and he was like, I could never be a soldier in Martin's army, is one of like his direct quotes, because I don't believe in nonviolence. What? We think of Robinson as being somebody who's like super nonviolent, right? Like, and totally dedicated. But he actually felt that, when push really came to shove, that maybe nonviolence wasn't the way to go, and that some of this later militance was, 100% justified. And so that's sort of interesting because I think we would have gotten more of that had Robinson even lived just a few more years.
Yeah, that's interesting because when I was making the point about there wasn't really the more challenging parts of his personhood, I'm mostly mean in terms of like there aren't, you know,
No
he didn't
scandal.
yeah, he didn't act in ways that were, his behavior
Right.
wasn't really out of line or,
Right.
whatever.
He was an upstanding citizen for sure.
Yeah,
For
and
sure.
in a way, it gives you this like entryway into dealing with the more socially challenging topics around Jackie's life,
Right.
and also, as you're pointing out, maybe deconstructing some ideologies about him that just really weren't
Right.
correct. You don't really necessarily know that without looking a little deeper. So, thinking a little more broadly for the museum field, how do you
Right.
recommend museums incorporate sports into their interpretive planning? Like, what would be your recommendations given the experience that you guys have had there?
Right. Well, one, I think sports is so universal that there are very few people who, I mean, and we talked about this a little bit about the sports ball people who are like, I don't like sports, that I don't watch sports, that any of the sports ball, activities.
Right.
But I do think it attaches people either through nostalgia or, fandom, that the majority of people do feel attached to sports in some way. Oh, I watched the ball games with my grandfather, or, me and my dad, did these things together. Or as a kid, I played sports. Obviously I was never good enough to go on, but I love sports, just for my own, because I participated at one point. And so they're really universal in that way. I think, there isn't anybody that you can't really reach through a great sports story. And so sort of like that's, I always think is like the entry point for sports. And they allow you in really, because they are so, universal and nostalgic, to really like take a crack at some of the harder things that there are to talk about. Because people are going to be like, oh, sure, I'm going to go see that, that baseball exhibit, or I'm going to go see that basketball exhibit, or I'm going to go see that, exhibit about LeBron James because he's interesting to me and I love basketball. And through that, you can find your way to tell sort of more complicated stories about, the history of the United States, desegregation, the role of, LGBTQ people in American social life, or even more vastly, more globally. Because, thinking sort of even outside of the United States, like the absolute love of, they don't call it that here, soccer, but like sort of that universal love of football outside of the United States is a great way to get people, one, sort of interested in just coming and experiencing because they feel connected to it. But even more broadly, it does open the door to talking about uncomfortable things. And one of the things that we talked about a lot, particularly during the time that we were sort of shifting gears. And, even though we're still going to talk about, Jackie and equal rights, but how we're going to frame that is going to be different. And there was a lot of like, aren't we going to be driving a lot of people off? And I thought, no, I don't think we're going to be driving people off. I think at the end of the day, that when you want to talk about hard things, if you put them in the framework of people that maybe they idolize, or maybe it's, built around something that they love, they're actually more open to hearing the hard stuff than they would be if you were like, let's just do an exhibit about desegregation in the United States. Ouch, that's, not that there isn't a place for that, but I feel like this is like the soft way of like introducing hard topics to people who wouldn't, otherwise be open to them, or would be like, well, I'm never going to that exhibit because that has nothing for me. Whereas it's like, oh, we talk a lot about, equality and equity, desegregation, the sort of the whole backbone of the museum is a timeline of the 20th century. That's all African American history stories. It is, and I say it's the history of the United States, but told through, a Black lens, and specifically through this lens of the Robinsons and the Isoms, who are Rachel's family, because at every sort of point along the timeline, from 1919 with the Red Summer to, the death of Martin Luther King, we're looking at lots of really hard, difficult stories. But at the same time, layered amongst that American history, we're also telling really powerful stories about Black joy, Black success. And so I think a lot of people who think they're coming to the Jackie Robinson Museum, who are going to hear lots of stuff about baseball, are actually getting a huge education on American history that they wouldn't otherwise be able to have engaged with, because if you had framed it that way for them, they wouldn't have been interested. So I think like that's the why to do sports. And then sort of when we think about like, the best practices behind that, and the way that we introduce people to these things, I think number one, you don't have to be a sports museum to use this. Like every museum should be thinking about, and it obviously doesn't even need to be sports. Like maybe it's dance, maybe it's theater, maybe it's music, but bringing people to hard topics through that idea of sort of a soft landing, I think is at the center of that. One of the things we didn't, I don't think, spend as much time talking about is we had an advisory board. And I think that was like so crucial when you're thinking about how you're going to use sport or anything really to engage with, you know, what we call sort of harder topics, right? Or things that might, you know, upset some of your viewers. We ensured, you know, through having about 25 different people in the sports world, in the American history world. We had people who were specialists on Black feminism, just a real wide variety of people who came and engaged with the content as we were building it out. So professors, journalists, you know, Tony Clark from the Players Association was on our board, just a really wide variety of people who could be like, time out. We don't like the way you're telling this story, or whoa, you missed something big here, was really important because I might now be, you know, the expert on Jackie Robinson, but what I am definitely not the expert on is the, you know, the vastness of American history. So I think that's really, really good practice. And actually, it's been sort of critical to a lot of the work that I've done. Even when I was at the Boston Children's Museum working on Native American stuff, we had a large Native American advisory board, and I just believe in, like, in the heart of hearts, that always having outside advice is critical to actually getting the best product you absolutely can. You should never be designing something sort of like under the cover of darkness that is just always a mistake. So even if it's, you know, how you guinea pig your interactives, you should always be having outside consultation as you're doing this work. And so, you know, there's that. And then there's even just sort of the, you know, smaller ways you engage with your audience. I think sort of any kind of like surveying and, you know, the sort of the practice of getting advice from your audience themselves as you're developing these things are also really important parts of the practice. And so we did a series of focus groups as we were building this out, even when we changed direction entirely, particularly around our education programs, because that was part of this process as well, that we were always sort of engaging with a multitude of voices, and that included young people. Particularly when we were thinking about what our field trips were going to look like, we brought in a bunch of young people to engage with the material, to think about how we were doing this work. Our staff on the scholarship side sat through many a brown bag lunch where they had to tolerate all of us who were working on this project. So I think, you know, all of those kinds of things are sort of like the critical best practices and how we do this work.
Thank you, Jennifer, so much for that deep dive into the best practices. And I want to leave. We've got about 10 minutes to the top of the
Okay.
hour. So for anybody that only has until then, I want to leave a little bit of time for Q&A. And like I said, we will stay on longer to keep having more of a discussion if anybody wants to continue to ask questions. But I want to just open it up now to those of you who are here and see any comments, thoughts, questions that you have for Jennifer, as we kind of look into this topic of inclusivity.
You're all so quiet. I don't bite,
Yep.
I swear.
I
I,
had,
or
yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
sure. I'd be curious if you have gotten feedback either way about the interpretation, whether it's been well received by all groups of people, or if people have issues with the more civil rights focused interpretation. I'd be curious about that.
So we have sort of universally, at least in that area, gotten really high marks on the interpretation. People have really enjoyed the experience. Nobody has sort of come at us for being maybe woke or any of those kinds of things. But again, I think we also have the advantage of being like sort of also a Black museum, in the sense that our subject matter is about Black people very specifically. And so I don't think anybody has gone out of their way to sort of point a finger. That isn't to say that we haven't had negative reactions, but it hasn't been to the content. I think, some people are like, you don't have enough places to sit, or you don't have a cafe, or you don't have this, or you don't have that. Or, I think we've had more pushback actually on accessibility, that we don't have, Braille readers. And so actually right now we're working to actually address accessibility through some audio guides, some VTS work. We've yeah, so like that's sort of we've done like a social narrative. We're working with the Department of Ed in New York City to engage kids with disabilities. So I think there are sort of like, that's really where we've been dinged the hardest, but not on content, which I'm unbelievably grateful for.
Yeah,
Jennifer, can you talk about the education programs and
Sure.
how that supports, the main visitor experience?
Yes. So as we developed the content alongside the educational interpretation, so those two things were happening in tandem. And actually, we were a very, very tiny group. There were 5 of us total. So 2 people on the education side, 3 of us on content when we began in 2018. And we knew from sort of the get-go that sort of the most important thing that we wanted visitors to leave with was the idea that you could be like Jackie. And we're pretty like strongly, we don't walk in Jackie's shoes. We don't walk in anybody's shoes, because we can't actually understand what that experience would be like for anybody. And so that's not a model that we were interested in repeating, but rather, how can I be a leader like Jackie? Or how can I be a voice for change like Jackie? So there's sort of 2 things that are happening sort of alongside. We developed an interactive, which was on the screen. You could see it. It said, speak out, stand up. That engages with what we call the scoreboard, which is that long, giant 70-foot screen up in the gallery. And basically, we engage with the visitors to select a topic that they care about. So that could be, civil rights, education reform, prison reform. We have all of these lists that you can choose from. And then once you get inside what you've chosen from, the different ways that you can engage. So you can say, I'm going to write a letter to my senator. I'm going to, get a group together. I'm going to vote. There's a variety of different ways you can engage as well. And then you sign this pledge, and then your signed ball goes up on the screen. And if you're in the last 50 or so visitors, you see your signed ball up on the screen. And alongside that, the educational programming was developed about Jackie Robinson, your leader. I can't actually remember the name of the program now, because that is not what I do. But actually, we used that fundamental idea to go through the entire experience of the museum, identify ways that Jackie Robinson is a leader. And we have this in a variety of age groups. So from, 2nd to 3rd, 4th and 5th, middle grades, and then high school. So it's all age differentiated. So the programming is slightly different, but it's the same basically content and idea. And then we challenge the kids at the end of their 90-minute field trip to also come up with a program along this idea of speak out, stand up, how they can do something for their community, their school, and actually make change in a positive way. And we then check back in with those kids. We didn't have a full year of programming last year, but this year in May, June, sort of at the end of the year, we're going to invite some of those groups actually to come back, talk about their projects that they developed as like a talk back with other groups from different schools. So not everybody will come back and have this experience. It is a select number as we're sort of piloting this sort of extension to the field trip program, but we're really looking forward to that, because we really do want the kids to feel like, you know, here's this guy, he's larger than life in so many ways, but that you too can actually do the very thing that, you know, he valued most of all, which is standing up for others and using your voice to make profound change in your own community. And so we really do want to see what the end results of these projects are, because, you know, they're basically just seeds of ideas, but then their teachers go back to the classroom and really work through these ideas. And so those two things are so like critically important and sort of parallel for us, is that the content really elucidates how he was a leader sort of across his life in so many different venues, and that, you know, we too can, if we choose to, be a leader just like him in a multitude of venues in our own lives and communities.
Wow, I'm really interested to hear the results of that. I mean, it's
Me
like
too.
love to see it, of creating an advocacy education program that actually puts advocacy in the hands of the students.
Yeah, it's really exciting. And it's funny. I mean, because obviously, you know, like the middle schoolers are too cool for school, right? Like they come in and they're sort of like, you know, yeah, whatever. But we really, it's so exciting to see the really little kids and then the high school students. They're so engaged, but I'm really curious because I know in my heart of heart that middle school students actually are just like this and they care just as much as, you know, their older and younger peers do. So I'm really most sort of interested to see what those projects look like, because I actually think they're going to be the most sort of like potent and compelling to see them in their, you know, their finished state, because yeah, they're just too cool for us when they come in for their programs.
Yeah. Other questions, comments, thoughts? Anything else you've seen similar in the field?
I have a quick question. Do you, and sorry if I missed this, but do you have temporary exhibit space where you have the ability to tackle like ongoing issues where this might be relevant? I think a lot about.
So we do have a small space. It's really programming space, so it's multi-use. So it's the space that we use for our programming. We have 2 classrooms, our collection storage, all up on the 2nd floor. And so we do intend to use that space for sort of smaller temporary exhibits. Some of the things we're thinking about is Jackie did a lot of work with youth advocacy across his entire life. And actually, Catherine and I was just talking about this, is he spent a lot of time actually writing to young people who wrote to him. And so there are a few examples in the museum of those letters, but not sort of the scope and the scale that we'd like to tell. So we're thinking about doing specific work on youth advocacy, but we're also really excited because one of the things that we had really hoped with this sort of multi-purpose space is if there was a moment that, you know, really needed a voice to respond almost immediately, we have a set of 8 sort of like temporary rolling cases that we can fill with stuff that we had originally used as part of a pop-up exhibit experience in the run-up to the museum opening. So we had traveled to like Essence Fest and to Play Ball Park with MLB and a handful of other, the National Urban League Conference. And we did these sort of like mini exhibits. So we have those and we're hoping that we can use them in that very sort of like, here is a need that we need to talk about. Let's do a, you know, a fast and dirty exhibit about this based on, you know, what we think Jackie's response would have been, or what artifacts that currently exist. Or maybe it's like, we also considered maybe like using classroom programs to also respond in a sort of a fast way and then doing small exhibits based on that. But we don't have like a large, you know, like 6,000 square foot, you know, temporary exhibit space, or even, you know, a 1,500 foot temporary exhibit space. It really is sort of about 600 square feet, really designed to be multi-purpose and multi-use.
I'm curious to know if any other examples that you guys have, if there are things that your museums are doing that are similar to this, or challenges you've encountered while you're trying to create a more inclusive narrative.
I would offer that our struggle is that it's a very white sport in a very white state. So we really struggle with how to in Vermont about skiing. So there is not inherent diversity. So we really struggle with how to feel relevant. I mean, we can talk about climate change, like there are more relevant issues that we can hit on, but diversity is a real struggle. And it just feels so hard in our world to not be, it doesn't always feel very sincere if it comes up. So I wonder about ways to do that in this culture.
Yeah,
That's
I
really
think,
interesting.
no,
Go
go
ahead,
ahead,
Jennifer.
Catherine.
No, I definitely want to hear what you have to say on this. So why don't you start? I'll
Yeah,
take-
I mean, I think, obviously that is super hard because you're right. Like skiing is not naturally a sport that is participated in by ethnic minorities. That's but I do think, and one of the things that I think back to doing this diversity in baseball exhibit that sort of brought me to the attention of the Jackie Robinson Museum was we looked at it was like, okay, we have our first Black player, we have our first Hispanic player, but like who was the first open, LGBTQ person who participated in your sport? Who was the first woman or women who you can call, to mind? Diversity doesn't just mean Black faces or brown faces. I think diversity can be so many more things than that. And so when we think about how we want to talk about equity, I am sure there is a large community of, disabled and I know that sounds sort of ableist, so I'm sorry already for saying that word, but people, who have other challenges, physical or mental or, any kind of challenge that you could talk about that brings the idea of inclusion into the work that you're doing. And I feel like there are always those opportunities because, yes, obviously, I am working in a space that has tons of Black and Hispanic faces. And today, if we're thinking about baseball, even sort of more broadly, Asian faces, it really has become a global sport. But skiing is definitely a global sport too. So I feel like there's probably opportunities there to like think about, skiing on a more global level that could allow you to think about inclusion in sort of different ways, that it doesn't always just have to be necessarily about a Black face.
Yeah, yes, those are a lot of the thoughts I had about what other types of diversity could come into the conversation. Neurodivergency, physical ailments that may interact with athletics, with skiing in particular, in your case, Meredith. Yeah, there's just so many different ways you can go. So that was a big thought I had. And the other one I had is about speaking to the absence of something. So you could actually talk about why there are not more why we don't see more people of color skiing, or why there isn't more of that in the subject matter that you have. I mean, you could sort of look at the negative space and talk about why that gap is happening and what the historical relevancy of that is. I don't know that, yeah, I love looking globally at the sport as well, and just sort of expanding the scope some. But if you get into people of color in a sport, you're typically also going to quickly get into looking at economic and financial disparities. And I mean, particularly with some of the sports that are a little bit less accessible, and skiing tends to be one of those. It's a little more difficult to, whether it has to do with location, where you have to physically be near a place where there's snow and mountains, otherwise you have to pay to get there, and then having the access to equipment and lift tickets, things like that quickly sort of add up costs. So I think there's a lot of avenues you can take with that if you start to look at the negative space. Those would be my initial thoughts on that. That's when I feel like I could go on about for a long time. I know Tennis Hall of Fame did a lot of work on that, looking at gender and the pay disparity, and then also the the access to the sport itself and like how that has evolved over time and who that involves and doesn't involve. Yeah. 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 Vermont is so small. It's a very unique niche little state. Yeah. Okay. Other thoughts, questions? Issues you've encountered around on this front?
Jennifer, I found it interesting that your museum uses some of that fan mail, like you were talking to. It's
Yep.
another way to kind of access education for kids to kind of write their own letters, maybe to heroes. Or have you? I know sometimes historical museums go back and forth with the push and pull of like, oh, do we publish this diary? Is this something that's meant to be public? Is that something you guys grappled with as you know, decided to make that a full-on section, or
Well, it's funny. I think with fan mail, and particularly since I would say the majority of these people who have written these letters are very old or are no longer with us, I think it makes it a little bit easier. Also, there's nothing said in these letters that is like particularly groundbreaking in any way. There are some back and forths with some young people talking about more personal issues that we certainly did not choose to use. We found a great letter, a copy of the letter that Jackie sent back to a young person who asked if he would display an American flag at his home. It was part of a like school project. He was a very young, kid in elementary school, and this teacher said, send these flags to all these famous people. And we reached out to him because Jackie responded with a 4-page letter on why he would not ever fly an American flag at his house and how totally disillusioned he was with the American government and the role of African Americans in American society. And actually, because the man who wrote the letter, and now he is a like 58-year-old man, and he was 68-year-old man who wrote the letter. We reached out to him, and Jeff has a very unusual last name, so I was able to find him. He was also in Washington State. There were only 2. I sent emails to both of them. One of them was pretty public. He was a politician. That was not my Jeff. I have the dentist, and I was able to reach out because he had his dental website, and he called me back within like 20 minutes to be like, oh my God. I was devastated because Jackie Robinson had written him back a 4-page letter that the teacher put up on a bulletin board. Some kid got really jealous, ripped it down and ripped it into a million pieces. And he was like, this has been like devastating my entire life, that like this man wrote me back this letter and it was so meaningful. And it talked about all these important things. It quotes Langston Hughes. It's this incredible letter. And we were able to send him a copy of the letter. And so I think, it's like our practice is always, we do not publish things, unless, we can't, unless we can, contact the person. But Jeff was like, you want to put my letter into the museum? And I was like, yes, I do. And so, it's those kinds of things that I think are so crucially important. But yes, our practice is definitely to reach out to people, but we do have some fan mail up that actually came from the collection of the Library of Congress. We couldn't find those people. And so we figure, since it's pretty much like, you're so great and I think you're wonderful, we felt pretty confident that we could put that in, and it wasn't going to be an issue.
That topic of nationality is really polarizing. Do you have much in regards to that topic? And if so, I mean, are you getting feedback on people's reactions to that? And it's a really tough one to address. Like, why would Jackie not want to put up the flag? And what are his thoughts on his
So,
country?
I mean, For me, I was like, everything that is old is new again, and everything that is new came before, right? Like all of those things existed, and it fits so nicely into the narrative of shut up and dribble, right? Like it's this, he really felt very strongly, and he was so disillusioned after all of this work he had done in the late 50s and early 60s around this idea of what he called first-class citizenship, that African Americans should not be second or third-class citizens, that they should have every right of everyone in the United States, that citizenship, grants us all equality under the eyes of the law, under, that was so crucial to like his belief system. And he was so devastated with the loss of JFK, with the loss of King, just all of these even actually the loss of Malcolm X. He felt so strongly that until he was really treated truly as a full citizen of the United States with all of the guarantees that were promised, that he just didn't feel comfortable flying a flag. And at the time, I don't know if it was 69 or 70, Hess gas stations were giving out these little flag stickers that people were putting on their cars. And he said, I know if I see somebody with that sticker on their car, they are not my friend. And so I think this is like a long-standing story that African Americans, even famous African Americans who, you don't think fit into this general narrative, are treated really very differently in the United States. And he gave very clear voice to this idea. And we hear this story time and time and time again, whether, it's with Curt Flood or it's with LeBron James, that OJ Simpson, like before his, crisis, all of these incredibly famous, outspoken Black athletes who were also activists really come to this conclusion very quickly that their voice is only valued in certain contexts. And Jackie is different in some ways because when Jackie started speaking out, there weren't any other Black athletes, celebrities around in the same way that there are today. And so I think he was given sort of more leeway and more freedom to speak out. He was also part of a very large movement, national movement that was going on. And so his voice was valued in a different way. But now we look at athletes and we say, your voice is not welcome here. We're not interested in what you have to say if it's outside of sport. And so sport and the idea of, activism have become incredibly complicated. And I don't know, that disillusionment really by the late 1960s fits very well in to this continuing narrative where we just don't want athletes to speak up or speak out.
Yeah, it's very, very relevant. I mean, as you pointed out, there's nothing new under the sun, right? It's a continuation of that conversation, and it's very relevant to today. And I think does strike a chord with a lot of people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, Colin Kaepernick, we could make lists of these people. So, I think for us, that was sort of very central to our narrative as well, is that using your voice is the clear distinguisher. And it doesn't matter what anybody says to you, that's what you should be doing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So.
You and I had talked a little bit about authority.
Mm-hmm.
Can you just say a little bit about how you guys treat the authority of over his life?
Yes. So like I said, I might be the person who knows, the most about him per se, just because of the research I've done, but I am not the authority on Jackie Robinson at all. And we believe very, very strongly that most narratives should be told through sort of the first person, that everyone should be able to speak on their own account. And so my job was basically to sort of usher along Jackie's voice and not determine, what he says. So we use a ton of Jackie's quotes in the museum. We use every opportunity we can to actually allow people to hear his voice, to read his newspaper columns, to actually hear Jackie speak about Jackie himself, because there was only one authority on Jackie. There is another section of the museum that's dedicated to Jackie's legacy. It's 42 screens with 42 different people sort of across all walks of life, primarily celebrities, though, talking about his impact on them. And it's very, we wanted to make it very clear that although that's incredibly important, that is not, that's not Jackie's voice, that Jackie's voice has to be the one that sort of leads our narratives. And so authority, and I mean, I feel like this is like true of my work, at least for the last decade, is always about putting the person who is being spoken about's voice first, and then sort of everything else afterwards. I think that's the only way to really do justice to any particularly individuals, but groups too, that it has to be their own voices telling their own narratives.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Thanks for sharing that. We have about 10 more minutes. If there are other questions, thoughts, comments. All right.
Yeah.
I think we might
Well,
be good.
certainly if anybody has any other questions, or you don't feel comfortable asking them online, I'm more than happy to do that. I don't know if Scarlett can put up the final slide. It has my contact information. I'm super happy to talk to anybody, particularly about their projects or struggles, or you just want to like weep into your coffee, because let me tell you, there were many days I felt that way. So I believe in being a supportive, if just nothing else, a shoulder to cry on as we sort of struggle through doing this work. It's it's incredibly important work. It's, I think, incredibly fulfilling work, but I know it's also really hard at times, and doing it justice is a struggle. So
I'm just realizing, thank you, Jennifer, for that and for being so generous with your time. I just want to point out Scarlett's question in the chat that I just, for some reason, just now seeing Scarlett. She says, speaking to absence too, how does art of a sport or advertising and posters play into who's represented and who is not?
Oh yeah, that was geared towards your comment around just Vermont. It's another way to kind of explore that topic, right, through posters or art or those materials that are produced. And
Yeah. Okay. I see what you're saying. Yeah.
Yeah.
Looking at the advertisements and the posters and the printed materials that are made, and see who's represented and who's not. Yeah. That's a really great point.
And Jennifer, I dropped your info in the chat for everybody too.
awesome. Thank you.
All right, you guys. Well, it's good to see everybody. Good to be together today. We will, our next community of practice is going to be in March. It will be March 12th. That's not right. It will be I'm not seeing the date. Oh, sorry, it's gonna be March 21st. I just said the numbers mixed. It's gonna be March 21st, and we are gonna hear about the Canadian museum that is using our book as a way to sort of redevelop their collection. So you can catch that. Scarlett just put the link into the chat. They're reimagining how they look at their collection through a different lens, and sort of coming away from the commemorative lens and looking at it very differently. So you can see that event there. Also, if you're not on our email list, you can email me at connect@interpretingsports.com, and I'll be sure you get information about everything that's coming up. And we will hopefully see you all next time. And thanks everybody. Please send thoughts or ideas about engagement in the community of practice. We'd love to have more voices involved as well.
Yeah. Thanks for having me today. This was fun.
Thank you.
Jennifer, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah.
It was an amazingly engaging topic, and I hope everybody gets a chance to visit the Jackie Robinson Museum in New York, send people there. This was really such a treat, Jennifer. Thank you so much, and thank you for the work that you're doing.
Thank you. All right. Have a good afternoon, everyone.
Bye, everybody.